The rain arrived before dusk, drifting across the countryside in long silver veils that blurred the gardens of Hawthorne Manor into a watercolor dream. Beyond the iron gates, carriages rolled through the mud carrying guests eager for the season's final gathering, and within the great house hundreds of candles glowed against gilded walls, casting a warmth that seemed capable of banishing every sorrow. Yet sorrow, like a determined ghost, often found its way through the brightest doors. Margaret Hawthorne stood at the top of the grand staircase, one gloved hand resting lightly upon the polished banister. The emerald silk of her gown shimmered beneath the chandeliers, and her dark hair was arranged with such elegance that more than one lady glanced upward with envy. To those assembled below, she appeared the very image of fortune. She was young, beautiful, married to one of England's most respected noblemen, and mistress of one of the finest estates in the county. Only Margaret knew how hard she had once prayed for such happiness. Before her marriage, she had lived a quiet life overshadowed by louder personalities and grander fortunes. She had learned early that the world often overlooked gentle women. Yet Lord Edmund Hawthorne had noticed her. He had spoken to her with patience. He had listened when others interrupted. He had offered kindness without demanding performance in return. For nearly a year she had allowed herself to believe she was cherished. As the guests gathered below, fragments of conversation floated upward like smoke. "Lady Hawthorne grows lovelier every day." "She certainly does." "A remarkable resemblance, is it not?" Margaret's smile faltered. The second voice lowered to a whisper. "One might almost mistake her for the First Lady Hawthorne." A ripple of restrained amusement followed. Margaret remained perfectly still. The First Lady Hawthorne. Even now, 3 years after her death, Eleanor Hawthorne remained a presence within the manor. Her portrait hung in the west wing. Her name appeared in old conversations. Her memory lingered in the admiration of society. Margaret had long attempted to ignore the comparisons, dismissing them as the idle habits of people who preferred gossip to kindness. Yet the remarks had become more frequent. Too frequent. As she descended the staircase, she caught her reflection in a gilded mirror and found herself studying features she had never questioned before. Dark hair. Delicate jawline. Wide eyes. Had they truly been speaking of a resemblance? Or had they simply invented one because society enjoyed its stories? The evening unfolded with practiced grace. Musicians played. Crystal glasses chimed. Gentle laughter filled the ballroom. Edmund remained the perfect host, greeting guests with quiet confidence. He was a tall man with thoughtful eyes and a composure that rarely cracked. Whenever his gaze found Margaret across the room, he offered a faint smile that still possessed the power to steady her heart. Yet something troubled her. Perhaps it was the whispers. Perhaps it was the way several guests glanced between her and a distant corridor leading toward the west wing. Or perhaps it was the strange feeling that she was standing in a place already occupied by another woman. Hours later the final guest departed. The manor settled into silence. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Margaret wandered the corridors unable to sleep. The candles had been extinguished throughout most of the house, leaving only scattered pools of golden light. She moved slowly through the shadows, listening to the distant crackle of fireplaces and the groan of old timber beneath the storm. That was when she noticed a faint glow beneath a door at the far end of the west wing. She stopped. The room was always locked. Servants rarely entered it. Even Edmund avoided speaking of it. A strange unease stirred within her chest. She approached quietly. The door stood slightly ajar. Through the narrow opening she glimpsed a room illuminated by candlelight. Rich carpets covered the floor. Shelves lined the walls. Fresh flowers stood arranged beside a marble fireplace. And above the mantel hung a magnificent portrait. The woman in the painting wore pale blue silk and carried herself with effortless grace. Though painted years earlier, she seemed almost alive beneath the flickering light. Eleanor. Margaret's breath caught. For the first time she stood face to face with the woman whose memory haunted every corner of the estate. Then she noticed Edmund. He stood alone before the portrait. His expression held none of the calm reserve he showed the world. Instead there was vulnerability in his face, raw and unguarded. Slowly he lifted a hand and touched the frame. The gesture was so tender that Margaret felt as though she were witnessing something sacred. She should have left. She should have turned away. Instead she remained frozen beyond the doorway. For several moments he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely louder than the rain against the windows, he whispered words that shattered her world. "Forgive me, Eleanor." His eyes never left the portrait. A painful silence followed. Then came the sentence that buried itself like a knife in Margaret's heart. "She is only a replacement." The corridor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Every smile Edmund had given her, every gentle touch, every promise spoken beside candlelight suddenly felt uncertain. As Margaret stared at the painted face above the mantel, a terrible realization emerged from the darkness. The resemblance was not imagined. It was undeniable. The curve of the jaw, the dark hair, even the eyes. She was looking at a woman who might have been her reflection from another lifetime, and for the first time since becoming Lady Hawthorne, Margaret wondered whether she had ever truly been loved at all. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of pearl, but no light seemed capable of reaching the place where Margaret's heart had retreated. She stood beside the tall windows of her sitting room, watching mist drift across the gardens of Hawthorne Manor while the memory of Edmund's voice echoed relentlessly through her thoughts. She is only a replacement. The words had followed her through the night, stealing sleep and transforming every cherished memory into a source of doubt. Each smile he had offered, each act of consideration, each moment she had once treasured now appeared fragile, as though the foundations beneath them had never existed at all. A servant entered carrying correspondence on a silver tray. Margaret accepted the letters with practiced grace. The young woman curtsied and departed. Only when she was alone again did Margaret allow her composure to slip. For nearly a year she had built her life around the belief that she was loved. Now she found herself questioning whether she had merely inherited another woman's place. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Enter." Edmund stepped inside. He looked tired. The shadows beneath his eyes suggested he had slept little himself. For a fleeting moment guilt stirred within her. She had always been susceptible to his quiet sadness. Yet the image of him standing before Eleanor's portrait rose instantly between them. The distance returned. "I fear I neglected you yesterday," he said gently. "You were occupied with our guests." His gaze lingered upon her face. Something in her tone had changed. He sensed it. She knew he sensed it. Neither spoke of it. "I shall be traveling to the village this afternoon," he said. "The schoolhouse repairs require inspection." "How diligent of you." The reply sounded colder than intended. A faint crease appeared between his brows. Before he could respond, another servant arrived to announce breakfast. The interruption saved her. Margaret spent the following days moving through the manor like a graceful ghost. No scandal had erupted. No accusation had been spoken. Yet everything had altered. She attended dinners. She received callers. She fulfilled every duty expected of Lady Hawthorne. But she guarded her heart with increasing care. Edmund noticed. The man who often missed society's subtler games proved remarkably attentive where she was concerned. He watched her across rooms. He saw conversations. He lingered beside her during walks. Yet Margaret could not bring herself to trust any gesture she witnessed. If she resembled Eleanor, perhaps every kindness was directed toward a memory rather than a wife. One afternoon, nearly a week after the terrible discovery, a commotion spread through the manor. Servants hurried along corridors. Florists arrived carrying crates of white roses. Footmen transported velvet boxes under strict supervision. Curiosity stirred throughout the household. Even Margaret could not entirely ignore it. As evening approached, her maid appeared wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "My lady, his lordship requests your presence in the east drawing-room." Margaret set aside her book. "What occasion requires such ceremony?" "I do not know, my lady." The answer was clearly untrue. The maid's smile betrayed her. Moments later Margaret descended the staircase. The east drawing-room glowed with candlelight. Hundreds of roses filled the space with fragrance. Crystal prisms hanging from the chandeliers scattered light across polished floors. At the center of the room stood Edmund. For a brief instant she saw not the man who had wounded her but the husband she had once adored. He offered his hand. "Margaret." She accepted it cautiously. His expression softened. "I fear I have neglected something important." "What is that?" "You." Before she could answer, a servant stepped forward carrying a velvet case. Edmund opened it. A collective gasp arose from the household staff lingering discreetly near the doorway. Resting upon dark silk was an emerald necklace of extraordinary beauty. The stones glowed like captured fragments of a summer forest. Diamonds surrounded each emerald in delicate patterns resembling leaves touched by morning dew. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Even Margaret struggled to suppress her astonishment. "It is magnificent," she whispered. "It belongs to you." The room blurred slightly. Not because of the necklace, because of the tenderness in his voice. For one dangerous moment she wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that whatever haunted him no longer mattered. Edmund lifted the necklace. May I? Margaret hesitated. Then she turned. His fingers brushed lightly against the back of her neck as he fastened the clasp. The contact sent a painful ache through her chest. How cruel that the man capable of hurting her most remained the one whose touch she desired. When she faced the mirror, the necklace transformed her appearance entirely. The emeralds shimmered against her skin. Gasps filled the room again. Edmund's reflection met hers. You are beautiful. The compliment might once have made her blush. Now it merely deepened the wound. Beautiful. Or familiar. The distinction mattered more than he knew. Word of the gift spread rapidly through the county. Within days every drawing room discussed Lord Hawthorne's extraordinary display of devotion. Ladies envied Margaret. Gentlemen praised Edmund's generosity. Newspapers devoted paragraphs to descriptions of the jewels. Society saw romance. Margaret saw uncertainty wrapped in emeralds. Several mornings later she found herself exploring an unused portion of the manor's library. The household archives occupied a series of dusty cabinets rarely examined except by historians and estate solicitors. Margaret had no clear purpose in searching them. Perhaps she sought distraction. Perhaps she sought answers. Or perhaps some instinct deeper than reason guided her hands. Hours passed among ledgers and correspondence. Then she discovered a collection of invoices bearing the Hawthorne seal. One document caught her attention immediately. Her pulse slowed. The paper was dated 4 years earlier. 1 year before Eleanor's death. Margaret unfolded it carefully. At the top appeared the name of a renowned London jeweler. Beneath it was a detailed commission request. Emerald necklace. Custom design. Wedding gift. Prepared for Lady Eleanor Hawthorne. The room fell silent. Margaret read the document again. Then again. Each reading delivered the same blow. The necklace had never been intended for her. It had been created for Eleanor. The jewelers had begun their work before Eleanor died. The project had remained unfinished until recently. Margaret stared at the invoice as though it belonged to another language. Suddenly the lavish gift lost every trace of warmth. It was not a symbol of love. It was an artifact from a life interrupted. A promise made to another woman. That evening she locked herself inside her room and cried for the first time since overhearing Edmund's confession. Not dramatic tears. Not hysterical grief. Simply the quiet heartbreak of a woman realizing that even the most beautiful gift she had ever received belonged to someone else first. Days later London hosted one of the season's grandest balls. Attendance was practically mandatory. The event occupied an opulent mansion illuminated by thousands of candles. Music drifted through gilded halls. Diamonds glittered beneath crystal chandeliers. Nobility filled every room. Margaret arrived wearing the emerald necklace. Refusing to wear it would invite questions. Wearing it felt like carrying evidence of her humiliation. The moment she entered the ballroom, conversations paused. Eyes turned toward the jewels. Whispers followed. Edmund remained beside her. Steady. Attentive. Unreadable. For much of the evening she endured society's admiration with practiced dignity. Then came Lady Beatrice Whitmore. Beautiful, wealthy, and notorious for cruelty disguised as charm. She approached surrounded by companions eager for entertainment. "My dear Lady Hawthorne," she said sweetly. "What extraordinary emeralds." "Thank you. They suit you perfectly." Margaret inclined her head. Lady Beatrice smiled. "Then again, they were always intended to suit your particular appearance." The surrounding ladies exchanged glances. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, surely everyone notices." A ripple of laughter followed. Lady Beatrice continued. "You and the late Lady Hawthorne could almost be sisters." The words struck like open-handed slaps. More whispers spread. Margaret heard fragments. Replacement. Resemblance. Second chance. The ballroom seemed suddenly smaller. Hotter. Crueler. She maintained her posture through sheer force of will. Years of discipline prevented her humiliation from showing. Yet inside, something fragile began to fracture. Then another voice emerged. Oh, controlled. Dangerously calm. "That will be enough." Edmund stood beside her. The entire group fell silent. Lady Beatrice attempted a nervous smile. "My lord, we intended no offense." His gaze remained fixed upon her. "Then your intentions failed." The temperature of the room seemed to drop. No one spoke. No one moved. "Lady Hawthorne requires no comparison to any woman living or dead," Edmund said. "And I suggest anyone incapable of understanding that reconsider future conversation." The rebuke landed with devastating precision. Lady Beatrice flushed crimson. Her companions retreated immediately. Across the ballroom, whispers changed direction. For the first time since her marriage, Edmund had publicly challenged society on Margaret's behalf. The silence that followed carried its own power. Margaret stared at him. Confusion mingled with gratitude. If she truly meant nothing, why defend her so fiercely? Why risk scandal for her sake? The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. Hours later, their carriage rolled through darkness toward Hawthorne Manor. Rain tapped softly against the roof. Neither spoke. Yet tension filled the enclosed space. At last they reached home. Inside the manor, servants hurried forward with lamps. Edmund waited until they were alone in the entrance hall. The firelight cast long shadows across marble floors. His expression was grave, almost troubled. "Margaret." She looked at him. For a moment he seemed to struggle with something unseen. Then he took a slow breath. "What have you heard?" The question struck her like a bell tolling through silence. Before she could answer, the front doors opened behind them. A rain-soaked messenger entered carrying a sealed packet marked with Eleanor Hawthorne's name, and the color drained from Edmund's face as though the dead themselves had suddenly come calling. The rain-soaked messenger remained motionless in the entrance hall, water dripping from his coat onto the marble floor while every servant within sight seemed to forget how to breathe. The sealed packet in his hands appeared ordinary enough, yet the name written across its surface transformed it into something far more dangerous. Eleanor Hawthorne. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Edmund looked as though he had seen a ghost emerge from the storm. The messenger bowed awkwardly. "My lord, this was recently discovered among the effects of a deceased solicitor in London. Instructions attached to the packet required delivery to Hawthorne Manor." No one spoke. The crackling fire suddenly sounded unnaturally loud. Edmund accepted the packet with visible reluctance. His fingers tightened around it. For a moment Margaret thought he might throw it into the flames. Instead, he thanked the messenger and dismissed him. The front doors closed. Silence settled over the hall once more. Neither husband nor wife moved. The distance between them felt immeasurable. At last Edmund lowered his eyes to the packet. "What have you heard?" he repeated quietly. The question lingered in the air. Margaret's pulse thundered. This was the moment she had imagined countless times since overhearing his confession. The moment truth might finally emerge. Yet fear held her captive. Because once spoken aloud, some truths could never be gathered back. Before she could answer, Edmund glanced toward the sealed packet. "We shall discuss this tomorrow." Without another word he turned and walked away. Margaret watched him disappear up the staircase. The packet remained in his hand. So did the answers. Sleep proved impossible. The storm continued throughout the night, rattling windows and filling the darkness with restless sounds. Margaret lay awake listening to the rain. Again and again her thoughts returned to the packet, to Eleanor, to the portrait, to the terrible words that had shattered her confidence. She is only a replacement. Near dawn she made a decision. The next morning Hawthorne Manor carried an atmosphere of strained anticipation. Servants whispered. Footmen exchanged curious glances. Even the house itself seemed to wait. Margaret learned from a maid that Edmund had ridden out shortly after sunrise to inspect estate matters. The information stirred something reckless inside her. An hour later she stood outside his private study. Her heart pounded. The door opened easily. The room smelled faintly of leather, ink, and extinguished candles. Sunlight streamed through tall windows. Everything appeared orderly, controlled, just like Edmund himself. Margaret crossed to the desk. For several moments she simply stood there. Then she noticed the packet. It rested inside an unlocked drawer. Waiting, or perhaps tempting. Her conscience urged retreat. Her wounded heart demanded answers. The second voice prevailed. With trembling fingers she broke the seal. Inside lay several folded letters tied together by a faded ribbon. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. Margaret knew immediately. The elegant script carried a feminine confidence she somehow recognized from the portrait. She unfolded the first letter. The room disappeared around her. Only the words remained. Eleanor wrote with intelligence and wit. She described London society, family obligations, ordinary concerns. Yet beneath the polished language Margaret sensed something unexpected. Loneliness. The second letter deepened the impression. Eleanor spoke of expectations she struggled to meet, of duties that left her exhausted, of an engagement that appeared perfect to outsiders. Margaret's pulse quickened. The third letter contained the revelation that left her staring in disbelief. "I respect Lord Hawthorne greatly," Eleanor had written. "He is honorable beyond question. Yet I fear respect alone cannot create the sort of affection poets celebrate. He deserves a wife capable of loving him fully, and I deserve the freedom to discover whether such love exists for me elsewhere. Margaret read the passage repeatedly. Society had always described Eleanor and Edmund as a tragic romance interrupted by death. The letters painted an entirely different picture. There was admiration. There was friendship. But there was no passionate devotion. No grand love story. No fairy tale. Only two people moving dutifully toward a future neither fully understood. The realization shook her. A sudden sound interrupted her thoughts. The study door opened. Margaret froze. Edmund stood on the threshold. For several endless seconds neither moved. His gaze shifted from her face to the letters scattered across the desk. Shock flashed across his features. Then something stranger followed. Not anger. Not outrage. Weariness. Profound, heartbreaking weariness. Margaret rose slowly. I can explain. No, he said quietly. I believe I understand. The simplicity of the response unsettled her more than fury would have. He crossed the room and stopped beside the fireplace. The tension between them thickened. At last Margaret gathered her courage. I read them. I know. They do not say what I expected. A faint smile touched his mouth. It carried no happiness. Few truths do. The words lingered. Margaret's emotions threatened to overwhelm her. Confusion. Resentment. All tangled together. She could bear uncertainty no longer. You asked what I heard. Edmund looked at her. The moment had arrived. You knew. I suspected. Margaret stared at him. Months of confusion erupted at once. Then tell me the truth. He remained silent. Her heart broke a little further. Am I merely a shadow standing where another woman once stood? The question echoed through the study. Edmund did not answer immediately. His hesitation proved devastating. Margaret looked away. The delay felt like confirmation. If she mattered, surely he would deny it instantly. Surely he would fight for her. Instead, silence stretched endlessly. At last Edmund moved toward the window. Rain clouds drifted across the horizon. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of years. Eleanor was my first love. Margaret flinched. The words hurt despite everything. I loved her sincerely. His gaze remained fixed outside. When she died, something in me died as well. The confession emerged slowly, as though every sentence cost him effort. For a long time I believed grief was proof of devotion. The deeper the suffering, the greater the love. Margaret listened quietly. Society encouraged the illusion, he continued. People admire tragic stories. They transformed Eleanor into perfection. Eventually I began believing the myth myself. A bitter smile appeared. I mourn not only a woman but an idea. Margaret's chest tightened. The honesty in his voice made anger difficult. Yet the wound remained. What does that have to do with me? He turned toward her. Everything changed in that instant. For the first time she saw genuine anguish behind his composure. When I met you, I was frightened. The answer surprised her. Frightened? Because you resembled her. The admission landed softly. Not cruelly. Not dismissively. Simply true. I noticed it immediately. Margaret lowered her eyes. He continued. At first I avoided you. Fragments of memory returned. Missed conversations. Unexpected absences. Moments that suddenly made sense. Then I spoke with you. His expression softened. And nothing was the same afterward. The room grew very still. Margaret scarcely dared breathe. You were kind where she was sharp. Patient where she was restless. Brave in ways no one recognized. His voice dropped lower. I found myself looking forward to seeing you. Pain flickered across his features. That terrified me. Why? Because loving you felt like betraying my grief. The words struck her with unexpected force. Edmund looked away. I married you believing I could manage both. Margaret's heart sank. The confession sounded dangerously close to what she had feared. He noticed. A shadow crossed his face. I know how that sounds. It sounds as though I was second choice. The sentence escaped before she could stop it. For a moment neither moved. Then Edmund shook his head. No. The answer came instantly. Certain. Unmistakable. Margaret stared at him. The tragedy is not that you replaced her. His voice carried a quiet intensity she had never heard before. The tragedy is that I spent too long pretending you had not replaced my grief. The room seemed to shift. The distinction was subtle, yet enormous. Margaret searched his face. Every carefully constructed defense she had built over recent weeks began to weaken. Not disappear. Not completely. But weaken. Because for the first time she sensed truth rather than performance. The silence that followed felt different. Less hostile. More fragile. As though they stood upon the edge of understanding. Then Edmund crossed to the desk. Among the letters lay one final document. Older than the rest. Unopened. His expression changed immediately. Confusion replaced sorrow. Slowly he lifted the paper. The seal had been broken years ago. Yet neither of them recognized it. "What is it?" Margaret asked. Edmund studied the handwriting. His face paled. The transformation happened so quickly that fear gripped her. He swallowed hard. This shouldn't exist. A chill swept through the room. Why? His eyes lifted to hers. Because this letter was dated 3 days before Eleanor died, addressed to a man neither of them had ever heard named in connection with her, and beneath the unfamiliar name was a single sentence that threatened to unravel everything they thought they knew about the woman in the portrait. "My dearest love, by the time this reaches you, I pray I shall have found the courage to end my engagement forever." The letter remained motionless in Edmund's hands, yet it seemed to possess enough power to shake the foundations of Hawthorne Manor itself. Neither he nor Margaret spoke. The silence stretching between them was no longer filled solely with grief or misunderstanding. It now carried something far more dangerous. Uncertainty. For years Eleanor Hawthorne had existed as a legend. A beautiful woman lost too soon. A tragic romance interrupted by fate. A memory polished smooth by time and protected by society's affection for sorrowful stories. Now a single letter threatened to destroy that legend entirely. Edmund stared at the unfamiliar name written upon the page. Margaret watched him carefully. The shock in his expression appeared genuine. Whatever truth lay hidden inside the letter, he had not known it. Slowly he unfolded the remaining pages. His hands trembled. The movement alone revealed more vulnerability than Margaret had witnessed in him during their entire marriage. Without asking permission, she stepped closer. For the first time in weeks, neither retreated from the other's presence. Together they began to read. The letter was written in Eleanor's unmistakable hand. Its contents were brief, painfully brief. Yet every line carried the weight of a confession. "My dearest love, I can no longer continue this deception. Lord Hawthorne deserves honesty, and I fear I have lacked the courage to offer it. I respect him deeply, yet my heart has never belonged to him. It belongs to you. I intend to speak with him soon. Whatever consequences follow, they will be preferable to a lifetime built upon a lie. Pray that I find the strength to do what should have been done long ago. Yours always, Eleanor." The room seemed to darken around them. Margaret reread the final lines. Then again. The meaning never changed. Eleanor had intended to end the engagement. Not because she disliked Edmund. Not because she questioned his character. Because she loved someone else. A strange mixture of emotions swept through Margaret. Relief. Confusion. Sympathy. Sadness. Most unexpectedly, she felt sorrow for Eleanor herself. The woman in the portrait had become trapped inside a story she never intended to tell. Beside her, Edmund lowered the letter. His face had gone pale. Not with heartbreak. With revelation. The distinction mattered. Margaret suddenly realized she was witnessing the collapse of a belief he had carried for years. Not the loss of Eleanor. The loss of the myth surrounding her. For several moments he simply stood there. Then he crossed the room and sank into a chair beside the window. Rain drifted against the glass outside. The gray afternoon seemed perfectly suited to the unraveling of old illusions. Margaret remained where she was. Neither knew how to proceed. At last Edmund laughed softly. The sound startled her. There was no humor in it. Only disbelief. "I spent 3 years mourning a future that never existed." Margaret said nothing. He looked down at the letter. She was going to leave. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, as though he still struggled to believe them. "I would never have forced her to stay." His gaze drifted toward the rain. "Had she spoken honestly, I would have released her immediately." Margaret believed him. That was the tragedy. Eleanor had feared a confrontation that likely never needed to happen. Edmund folded the letter carefully. The gesture carried no anger, no bitterness, only acceptance. A man placing a burden down after carrying it too long. "I thought I knew her." His voice had become quieter. "Perhaps I never truly did." Margaret studied him. The proud lord admired by society seemed suddenly very human, very tired, and very alone. She crossed the room. For the first time since overhearing his devastating confession, she sat beside him. The distance between them had not disappeared, but it had narrowed significantly. Neither spoke for several minutes. The crackling fire provided the only sound. Eventually Edmund turned toward her. "I owe you an apology." Margaret's heart tightened. "You owe me honesty." A faint smile touched his lips. "That as well." The smile vanished almost immediately. "I have been unfair to you." The admission carried remarkable sincerity. "You married a man still living among ghosts." Margaret lowered her gaze. The description felt painfully accurate. "You gave me patience when I deserved frustration." He continued quietly. "You gave me affection when I offered uncertainty." The honesty in his voice made it difficult to maintain her anger. Not because the pain had vanished, because she could finally see its source. He had not set out to deceive her. He had simply become trapped inside his own grief. A prison built from memory and guilt. Margaret folded her hands together. "Why keep the portrait room?" Edmund followed her gaze toward the fire. The answer took time. "At first because I believed forgetting would be betrayal." His expression darkened. "Then because I no longer knew who I was without the mourning." The confession struck her deeply. There was something profoundly tragic about a man defining himself through loss. She understood now why he had seemed distant even during moments of happiness. Part of him had been afraid to move forward. Afraid to heal. Because healing might appear disloyal. The realization softened something inside her. Not completely, but enough. Enough to allow compassion beside hurt. Enough to allow hope beside disappointment. The afternoon gradually surrendered to evening. Shadows lengthened across the study. Candles were lit. The atmosphere grew intimate. Neither noticed how much time had passed. Eventually Edmund rose. "There is something I wish to show you." Margaret followed him through the manor. Their footsteps echoed softly through familiar corridors. For months those hallways had felt haunted by comparisons and whispered judgments. Tonight they felt strangely different. As though old certainties had begun crumbling. They reached the west wing. Margaret's pulse quickened. The portrait room awaited beyond the door. For weeks she had avoided returning. Now Edmund opened it himself. The familiar scent of roses greeted them. Firelight danced across polished surfaces. And above the mantel hung Eleanor's portrait. The painting appeared exactly as before. Elegant. Beautiful. Serene. Yet Margaret no longer viewed it the same way. The woman before her was not a rival. Not a saint. Not an impossible standard. She was simply human. Flawed. Complicated. Capable of mistakes. Capable of fear. Capable of loving the wrong person at the wrong time. The transformation felt liberating. Edmund approached the portrait. For a moment Margaret feared he would retreat into old habits. Instead he regarded the painting with remarkable calm. Not devotion. Not longing. Understanding. A chapter of his life finally viewed without illusion. "I spent years believing this room honored her memory." His voice echoed gently through the chamber. "Now I think it honored my refusal to let go." Margaret stood beside him. The silence between them no longer felt hostile. Only thoughtful. At length she gathered the courage to ask the question that still mattered most. If there had been no resemblance. Edmund turned toward her. She swallowed. "If I had looked entirely different, would you still have chosen me?" The room became very still. No crackling fire. No distant wind. Only the question. And the answer waiting beyond it. Edmund stared at her. Not the portrait. Not the past. Her. The intensity of his gaze made her heart tremble. For once there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. No painful silence. 1,000 times. The words arrived immediately. Certain. Absolute. Margaret felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her throat. He stepped closer. "Not because of your face." His voice had softened. "Though it is beautiful." The faintest smile touched his lips. Then seriousness returned. "I would choose you because you possess a kindness stronger than pride." Another step. "Because you remained gracious when society rewarded cruelty." Closer still. "Because you see people as they are rather than as they appear." Margaret could barely breathe. Years of restraint seemed to dissolve from him. Every truth long buried was finally emerging. "I would choose you because when I was at my worst, you offered me your best." His eyes shone with emotion. "Because every room becomes warmer when you enter it." A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek. She made no attempt to hide it. Edmund reached forward hesitantly. Not demanding. Not assuming. Simply offering. When his fingers brushed her face, she did not pull away. The gesture felt entirely different from those before. Not performed out of obligation. Not inspired by memory. Real. Present. Alive. For the first time since their marriage began, there was no ghost standing between them. Only two wounded people learning how to see one another clearly. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. The ache inside her chest began easing. Not disappearing. Healing. The distinction mattered. When she opened her eyes again, Edmund was still there. Still looking at her. As though she alone occupied his thoughts. The realization carried extraordinary power. She had wanted this certainty for so long. Yet now that it existed, it felt almost overwhelming. Edmund glanced toward the portrait one final time. Then something unexpected caught his attention. A slight irregularity behind the frame. His expression shifted. Curiosity replaced emotion. Margaret followed his gaze. "What is it?" Without answering, he moved closer to the painting. Carefully he examined the ornate frame. Then he reached behind it. His fingers encountered something hidden. Both froze. The concealment appeared deliberate. A narrow compartment. Undisturbed for years. Slowly Edmund withdrew a folded document yellowed with age. Neither recognized it immediately. The paper had been concealed so perfectly that no one had discovered it before. His pulse visibly quickened. Margaret stepped beside him. Together they unfolded the hidden pages. The first line appeared in Eleanor's handwriting. The second stole the breath from both of them. And as Edmund read the opening words aloud, the portrait room seemed to hold its breath around them, because the document was not a confession of love, nor an explanation of betrayal, but a final message written only days before Eleanor's death. A message beginning with a sentence capable of changing everything they believed about the past. "If you are reading this, then I have run out of time to tell the truth myself." The portrait room stood silent beneath the glow of candlelight as Edmund unfolded the final hidden document. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers. Margaret remained beside him, close enough to hear his breathing, close enough to feel the tension radiating from him. For years Eleanor's portrait had governed this room like a queen presiding over memory. Now the truth concealed behind that portrait threatened to overturn everything. Edmund lowered his eyes to the page. Then he began to read. "If you are reading this, then I have run out of time to tell the truth myself." The words seemed to drift through the room like a departing spirit. Margaret listened carefully. Every sentence felt important. Every line felt final. "I owe an apology to the man the world believes I loved." Edmund swallowed. The candle flames flickered. "I admired Edmund Hawthorne. I respected him deeply. Yet I fear I allowed others to mistake respect for devotion." A long silence followed. Margaret watched him. The pain she expected to see never arrived. Instead she saw release. The kind of release that comes when a wound is finally cleaned after years of remaining hidden. Edmund continued reading. "The fault is mine. I lacked the courage to disappoint society. I lacked the courage to confess that my heart belonged elsewhere. Had I spoken honestly sooner, perhaps everyone involved would have been spared unnecessary sorrow." His voice weakened. Not because of heartbreak. Because of understanding. For years he had blamed fate for stealing a perfect future. Now he understood there had never been a perfect future waiting to be stolen. Only two people moving toward a marriage neither truly desired. The letter continued. "If Edmund someday finds happiness, I pray he will not sacrifice it in loyalty to my memory. The dead ask for remembrance, not imprisonment." Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes. The sentence carried remarkable wisdom. More importantly, it sounded like permission. Permission Edmund had needed for years. Permission he had never granted himself. The final lines were brief. "I hope he chooses life. I hope he chooses love. And I hope he forgives me." The letter ended there. Nothing more. No dramatic revelation. No elaborate confession. Only truth. Simple and devastating truth. The room remained quiet. Neither moved. Neither spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, wind brushed against the manor windows. Inside, years of misunderstanding slowly dissolved. At last Edmund folded the letter. Carefully. Respectfully. Then he placed it upon the mantel beneath Eleanor's portrait. His eyes rested upon the painting. Not with longing. Not with regret. With peace. The transformation in him was unmistakable. Margaret realized she was witnessing the end of a mourning period that should have concluded long ago. Not because Eleanor deserved to be forgotten. Because she deserved to be remembered honestly. After several moments Edmund turned toward her. Emotion filled his eyes. Raw. Unhidden. "I wasted so much time." Margaret shook her head gently. "You survived." "No." His voice was firm. "I hid." The distinction mattered. She understood that. For years he had hidden inside grief because grief felt safer than uncertainty, safer than vulnerability, safer than loving someone new. The realization seemed to strike him with fresh force. He stepped toward her. "Do you know what frightens me most?" Margaret remained silent. He laughed softly. The sound carried sadness. "Not that Eleanor loved someone else." His gaze locked with hers. "Not that society was wrong." Another step. "What frightens me is how close I came to losing you while mourning a life that never existed." The words entered her heart with extraordinary force. For weeks she had wondered whether she mattered, whether she was merely standing inside another woman's shadow. Now she could finally see the answer. She had never been competing with Eleanor. She had been competing with grief itself. And grief was finally losing. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Edmund reached for her hand. This time she took it willingly. The simple touch carried more intimacy than any embrace, because it was chosen freely, without ghosts, without comparison, without fear. For several moments neither spoke. The silence between them felt entirely different now. Comfortable, hopeful, alive. Then Edmund surprised her. He dropped to one knee. Margaret stared at him in astonishment. The gesture was entirely improper for a husband addressing his wife, yet somehow it felt perfect. He looked up at her. No title separated them. No expectations. Only honesty. "When I married you," he said quietly, "I gave you promises I was too broken to fulfill." His voice trembled. "I offered loyalty." Pause. "I offered protection." Another pause. "But I failed to offer the one thing you deserved most." Margaret's heart pounded. His grip tightened around her hand. "My whole heart." The room seemed to disappear. There was only his voice. Only his eyes. Only the truth. "I cannot change the past." He smiled sadly. "But if you will allow it, I would like to spend the rest of my life earning what I should have given from the beginning." Margaret could no longer stop crying. Not from sorrow. From relief. From release. From the extraordinary realization that the man she loved was finally standing before her without walls, without masks, without the burden of yesterday. She knelt beside him. For the first time since their marriage began, they occupied the same emotional ground. Neither above, neither below. Equal. "I never wanted perfection," she whispered. Edmund stared at her. "I only wanted truth." His eyes closed briefly. Then he nodded. "Then truth is what you shall have." When he kissed her forehead, the gesture felt infinitely more meaningful than passion. Felt like a vow. A beginning rather than an ending. A promise finally understood. Weeks passed. Winter arrived. Snow gathered across the Hawthorne estate, transforming gardens and fields into landscapes of silver and white. Inside the manor, change unfolded quietly. The portrait room remained open. Yet it no longer felt sacred. No longer felt haunted. It became simply another room. Part of the house. Part of history. Not the center of it. The greatest change occurred within Edmund himself. The servants noticed it first. He smiled more often. Laughed more easily. Spent less time alone. The weight he had carried for years gradually disappeared. Margaret noticed something else. Whenever he entered a room, his eyes sought her immediately. Not out of habit. Out of affection. The distinction warmed her more than any fire. By Christmas, Hawthorne Manor hosted its largest gathering in years. Members of the aristocracy traveled from neighboring counties. The ballroom glittered beneath thousands of candles. Music filled the air. Laughter echoed through magnificent halls. Among the guests stood many who had once whispered cruel comparisons. Many who had viewed Margaret as little more than a replacement. None knew the truth. Not yet. As the evening progressed, Edmund requested everyone's attention. Conversation faded. Music stopped. Curiosity spread through the room. Margaret stood beside him. Her pulse quickened. Something in his expression suggested purpose. Deliberate purpose. The crowd watched expectantly. Edmund surveyed the room. The silence deepened. Then he spoke. "For years this house honored a memory." The guests exchanged puzzled glances. No one interrupted. His voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "There is nothing wrong with remembrance." He paused. "But remembrance should never become a prison." Margaret felt emotion rise within her chest. Several older guests appeared uncomfortable. They understood exactly what he meant. Edmund continued. "I allowed grief to define me." The admission stunned the room. Aristocratic men rarely spoke so openly, especially before society. "I believed loyalty required me to live in the past." His gaze shifted toward Margaret. Everything softened. Everything. Then came the moment that would be discussed for years. For a long time I honored a memory. He reached for Margaret's hand. The gesture was simple, yet powerful. His voice deepened. Today I choose to honor my wife. The ballroom became utterly silent. Not a single glass moved. Not a single whisper emerged. Every eye fixed upon them. Edmund turned fully toward Margaret, not caring who watched, not caring who judged. The courage of that choice touched her profoundly. His next words shattered every comparison society had ever made. Not because she resembles another woman. A murmur spread through the room, then immediately vanished. Not because fate placed her in my path. His eyes never left hers. But because there has never been anyone like her. Tears filled Margaret's eyes once more. Around them, society's whispers finally died. Not gradually, instantly. Because no comparison could survive such certainty. No gossip could withstand such truth. The applause began slowly, then grew, then thundered through the ballroom. Yet Margaret barely heard it. She saw only Edmund, the man who had once stood before a portrait mourning the past, the man who now stood before her choosing the future. 1 year later, spring sunlight poured through the windows of Hawthorne Manor. The West Wing no longer housed a shrine to memory. The portrait room had become a library filled with books, laughter, and warmth. A nursery occupied the neighboring chamber. Its newest residents slept peacefully beneath embroidered blankets while Margaret sat nearby. Edmund entered quietly. His expression transformed the moment he saw them. There was wonder in it, gratitude, well, pure and unmistakable. He crossed the room and kissed Margaret gently. Then he looked down at their child. The future. Their future. Not borrowed. Not inherited. Not built upon comparison. Entirely their own. Outside, the gardens bloomed beneath the spring sun. Inside, peace finally settled over Hawthorne Manor. And as Margaret rested her head against Edmund's shoulder, she understood the truth that had taken both of them so long to find. The deepest love is not always the first love. It is the love that remains after illusions break. The love that survives truth. The love that chooses another person completely, not because they resemble a memory, but because they become the most beautiful part of the future. Once, Margaret had stood outside a door and heard herself called a replacement. Now, surrounded by the family they had built and the life they had chosen together, she understood how wrong that word had been. She had never replaced anyone. She had done something far more extraordinary. She had taught a grieving heart how to live again.